because that's what this was published. This particular research was published in an academic piece that I've given many presentations of it, both the non-academic and audiences and as well as academic ones. But it was meant to try to start to explore that, right? How do we kind of, there's this idea that historians are, we're kind of like these impartial or very overly objective or disconnected, I think is the better word, type of observers of the past, right? And there is a method to history, right? Where we do that. History is a science in that way, where we do try to follow a process, or, that is scientific, right? That helps us to ensure that we are both gathering our data appropriately and we are assessing it appropriately, we are interpreting it appropriately. But this project wanted particularly to get those voices that are often kind of, marginalized or silenced a little bit by that kind of academic, impartial kind of, or not impartial, but disconnected is the word, right? Kind of approach, and really try to portray something, like that gets across the feelings of something. So I immediately thought, like, well, it'd be great if we could focus on a place that kind of meant something to people. And as I thought about this, I want to give credit to Luis Fernandez, who's the executive director now of the Dominguez Rancho Adobe and Museum. At the time, I think he was recently finished his master's degree at Cal State Fullerton, and he still teaches at Sac College. And he had actually, I was kind of talking to him about this. I'm trying to think, I want to find some place in Orange County. Again, I was an outsider. My research was more into like desegregation in Orange County and stuff like that. Something that kind of gets at that. And Luis said, you know what? He's like, I had this student in my class, and her family started, showing Spanish language films in Orange County, and they own these movie theaters, and you should really talk to them, And he was kind enough to share with me a paper that she wrote for his class. And, again, I just want to credit them so much because I reached out to them, and I'm a stranger, I mean, there's this kid that's just emailing him saying, hey, I kind of think this story might be cool, and they welcomed me. So, I want to mention that, these histories don't exist. They don't get recorded. They don't have life in this way unless people are willing to share. And so I'm deeply indebted, again, to so many people in Orange County, particularly Olivos family, for this particular presentation today. If I can, I want to share two concepts that have been really helpful to me really quickly as I think about the past before I get into the presentation. I'm going to be quick on this, but I think it's really helpful. Just let me share my screen, okay, real quickly, and hopefully. Okay, can you all see this web page here? Can you see kind of images of like these old kind of looking papers and texts? Okay, great. Thank you, Tracy. Your head nodding is wonderful for me. So what this is depicting, you see the word there, it's a palimpsest. Okay, so a palimpsest is the idea, it's like this, it's an image, or it's like a manuscript, right? So a manuscript that has been reused over time. So these things are very old, right? So obviously, like long time ago, right? Well before the period of study, of history that I study, when paper was scarce and you had limited paper, you had to use paper over again. So what they would do is they would write on it, right? And then they would kind of efface it, try to like scrub it off, and then write over it. And you see in some of these images, they kind of like write in different directions, right? When they're reusing it, right? But what you get is this idea of this kind of layering or laminating, right? Is the kind of image that you're left over with. And I love this as an analogy to how the past works, because essentially if we're looking at Orange County, right? Orange County has only been a political thing, right, since like 1889, right? But as a landscape, as an ecology, right, as a place where people have existed for thousands of years, right? By the way, I want to acknowledge, right, our indigenous ancestors, right, to particularly the Southern California region, my home region, of Ventura County, the Chumash, my adopted home, San Diego County, the Kumeyaay, as well as the Tongva, right, in broader Los Angeles, greater Los Angeles, and of course the Apachemin, that are particular to, like San Luis Obispo. There are other groups, some of them, sometimes we know these groups more by their colonialized names, like the Gabrielino, Luiseño, etc., right? Those are the names that were assigned by, of course, the Spanish priests, right? But I want to acknowledge their presence as well as the presence of not just indigenous ancestors, but these people are living today in my own territory where I live, in northern Utah, the Ute, Paiute, Shoshone, as well as the Navajo, Diné, and the Goshute. Again, looking at the palimpsest, all history has taken place on the same landscape, right? The indigenous people that both lived before us and live along with us today, their history, is layered, right? It's not completely covered. It's not completely erased. Their contributions didn't go anywhere. Same thing with, right, the several, series of settlers and explorers that came upon the landscape in not only the Americas, but other parts of the world, right? So the palimpsest kind of gets at that, right? Where all of history is kind of taking place on this similar landscape that's shared. And the challenge for us is try to get at these different stories, right? And understand that the past that we're more used to and familiar with, of course, isn't the only past, right? There is no single narrative. And so the second analogy, real quickly, is those of you that are maybe into weaving, right, might know this a lot better than I do. But they're, essentially a piece of cloth is formed by creating this pattern of a warp and a weft, right? The warp, are the strands of the thread that go kind of north to south, the horizontal, right? And that is the core of the fabric. But the weft is what's woven into it horizontally goes up, over, between, right? And that adds depth and it adds color, it adds detail, right? So similar, historical narratives, that is the stories that we tell about the past, are very much like this, right? There are several strands, numerous strands that run both, vertically, right, north to south, right? There are also dozens and dozens, hundreds of, thousands of strands that run east to west or horizontally, right? And all of these things become woven together, right? And that's the challenge of us as we try to understand the past, is to try to get at that type of complexity, that type of entanglement, right? And to understand again that the narrative thread that I'm used to is my truth, and there's truth and there's facts that support it, right? But there are other threads that intersect with that, right? That are very different. They come from different perspectives. They come from different histories and backgrounds. Sometimes they come from different sources that we may not be used to, right? So the sources that I use for my presentation today are a mixture of both, very traditional sources, documentary records, particularly found in archives, as well as other sources that have become increasingly important to his social historians. Um, and that includes things like oral history, right? Also photographs, ephemera, and particularly for ethnic Mexican communities, for ethnic communities, underrepresented communities, these documents don't often find themselves or find their way into archives. Oftentimes, like many of the photos I will show today, they're kept in the households of the people that lived it. They are cherished possessions, and there's rightly a lot of reluctance sometimes to hand it over to institutions. And so the challenge is, how do we get to that, right? How do we access those sources so we can tell a fuller story, And again, it's due to wonderful people like the Olivoses and opening their homes, opening these sources that make this story, this history, possible. So I'm going to share excerpts from this the paper that was published, and I'm happy to share it with any of you. I will drop my email in the chat box at some point during this presentation, so you can just email me directly, because it's, you typically need like university access or some type of pay access to get to JSTOR and stuff like that to get it. But I'm happy to share it with anyone that's interested in order to read the whole thing. But I'm going to mostly focus on, again, the background of the Olivos family. Essentially, how is it that Spanish language film comes to be shown and screened in Orange County? The kind of context behind it. Why is it that it emerged when it did, by the person particularly that it did, as well as the larger impact, and of course how that intersects with Cine Yost or the Yost Theater. And there's several other theaters that are involved here, so it's not just the Yost, but that creates part of it is the most well-known theater, if you will, in Orange County. So let me Have that set. And let me begin. And I'm going to begin by sharing a quote that Tracy referred to earlier. And it was a quote by Louis Olivos Jr. As he reminisced on his family's 33-year history of owning the Yost Theater. And again, he said that the Yost Theater was our answer to the Grand Ole Opry. The A-list of Mexican movie stars appeared at the Yost in person. This was so central to, again, the development, as I will demonstrate and as I argue in the paper that this is all based on, to ethnic Mexicans finding a place of that for themselves in Orange County. Orange County, as many of you may know, has, again, many different stories, many different narratives, right? Perhaps the Grand Master narrative is the one that kind of is depicted maybe on the left, right? That experience by early migrants to Orange County in the late 1880s, 90s, etc., early 20th century. They're leaving the Midwest. They're coming from the South, the Northeast, right, in the United States. Some are coming from Europe, but a lot are also coming from Mexico. And a lot of them never crossed the border. The border crossed them, right? Whether they were Mexican, again, or whether they were Native American, right? Their lives were already existed. And they had deep histories to the region, right? So this gets back at those kind of imagery of the palimpsest and the warp and the weft, right? And so for what happened though is throughout the early 20th century, ethnic Mexicans become in ways outnumbered, they become displaced, right? So even though we know that Southern California, as well as much of the Southwest is part of Mexico, the rush and flood of migrants, right, that are brought by the railroads, industrialization, gold rush, all those things, right, soon, displace them and outnumber them to where ethnic Mexicans obviously find themselves as, what we refer to nowadays as a minority. I'm going to pick up the story again with Louis Olivos and his childhood and his background to try to depict what's happening, okay, in early 20th century Orange County, what leads him to, again, start screening Mexican or Spanish language films. And again, you have to bear with me because my keyboard's a little moved around here. So here's an early picture of Louis Olivos Sr. These are some of the records. Again, these are the more type of formal traditional records that we can find in the archive, right? Things tied to the census, like at the bottom, or birth or baptismal records up at the top. These are great tools for genealogists, family historians, etc. So Louis Olivos was born to Hilario and Juana Olivos. Louis was the youngest of the couple's 6 children and the second born in the United States. Like so many others residing in Orange County's ethnic Mexican community, the Olivos family fled their hometown of Durango, Mexico. Strange enough, that's where my mother's side of the family is from too. During the years of the Mexican Revolution, during 1910 to 1920. Arriving in Santa Ana in 1914, Hilario, who was again Louis's father, secured employment as a laborer on a nearby citrus ranch. And within a year's time, he had saved up enough money to bring Juana and their 4 children to join him. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Santa Ana, along with the rest of Orange County, experienced its second major population boom, which included families like the Olivoses, driven primarily by the prolific growth of the citrus industry. And all these slides here are from the Orange County archives, these pictures here. The population of Santa Ana nearly doubled every 10 years, from 4,933 in 1900 to 8,429 in 1910, and to 15,485 in 1920. Although ethnic Mexican settlements predated, again, the arrival of Anglos and Europeans to Santa Ana, during the late 1880s, ethnic Mexicans were in the minority. Even so, the socioeconomic turmoil brought upon by the Mexican Revolution created a resurgence, right, in the need for labor and migration, such that the ethnic population grew quite rapidly. Countywide, it went from 1,345 in 1910 to 3,694 in 1920, and 16,536 by 1930. Growing up in Santa Ana during the 1920s and 1930s exposed Louis to discriminatory treatment due to his ethnic Mexican heritage. As in other parts of the US Southwest, a mixture of de jure, that is by law, and de facto, that is by practice, policies marginalized ethnic Mexicans to a status of second-class citizenship. In Santa Ana, this took the form of segregated neighborhood schools and public amenities, which reflected the citrus industry's reliance on and management of a racially segmented labor force. Now, if living in one of Santa Ana's 3 segregated barrios or attending one of its 5 segregated schools did not strike Lewis as unusual, as, to be quite honest, it didn't for many people that grew up in barrios and colonias. It's essentially what they knew. And so a lot of them, particularly in their childhood years, didn't realize that they lived in segregated neighborhoods until they were older, right? But as a youth, Lewis was a regular patron on Friday nights to any one of Santa Ana's 5 bustling movie theaters. Here's a nice picture of downtown Santa Ana from the 1930s. And at cinemas like the Yost and State, he and his friends were forced to sit in the balcony section because, as he reminisced, they didn't let minorities sit downstairs. Even in theaters where there were no balconies, like the Princess on 4th Street, Mexicans were either denied admission or they were separated from whites by being forced to sit in segregated sections. Relishing their heroic protagonists, action-packed storylines, and clear-cut morality tales, Lewis became enthralled with Western films, but he later confessed to being troubled by the racist depictions of Mexicans as the bandit, the crook, and the guy sitting in the street with the big hat. Yet despite the discriminatory treatment and offensive material that led other members of the ethnic Mexican community to avoid going to places like, again, movie theaters or segregated parks and swimming pools, Lewis returned again and again because he loved the movies, even if he had to sit in segregated sections. Now, noticing as he got older that there were white employees that essentially didn't want to go up, to the balcony section because they were assigned to the upper section. Lewis approached the manager of, again, the Princess Theater, and he applied for a job. I knew all the guys up there, Lewis recalled, and I thought maybe they would behave if I was their supervisor. Just prior to his graduation from Santa Ana High School in 1936, Lewis was hired as an usher at $18 a week. With his newly acquired position, Lewis's thoughts immediately turned to Santa Ana's ethnic Mexican community and his memories of the ways in which Mexicans were depicted in film. I've always wanted to do something for my people, Lewis reflected in a 1981 interview. I wanted the people of Santa Ana to see what Mexico is, to know about its beautiful culture and history. And how could they know about Mexico except through the movies? Growing up in between these separate sociocultural worlds of Mexicans and whites, Lewis's desire to do something for his people stemmed as much from his firsthand experience with prejudice and discrimination as from his love for the cinema. Raised on a citrus ranch on the north side of Santa Ana, Lewis was among the first ethnic Mexican children to beat the odds, so to speak, by emerging out of Santa Ana's segregated school system with a high school diploma. As in other parts of the American Southwest, Orange County's 2-tiered school system reflected the values of society dependent upon agricultural capitalism. And I'll just return back to the slides covering segregation. Right? As such, Mexican children were not segregated to help educate or Americanize them, or to integrate them into the larger white society. Rather, these efforts were part of a systematic approach to managing Mexican labor by tracking children into vocational programs that prepared them to fill the manual labor and domestic service positions occupied by their parents. Now, viewing film as a medium to both educate and inspire the community, Olivos approached Charles Walker, the owner of the Princess, State, West Coast, and Yost theaters, and convinced him to start screening Spanish language films on a weekly basis at the Princess on 4th Street, where attendance had dipped to the point that Walker considered actually even closing the theater entirely. In order to ensure turnout, Lewis mapped out an 85-mile route that crisscrossed Orange County to distribute playbills and post advertisements in the dozens of ethnic Mexican colonias and barrios dispersed throughout the region. I'll forward this. Oh, that's my thing's freezing up. Let me just forward it a little bit to give an idea of what those bills, these were later ones, but essentially these are kind of little advertisements that they published, as well as taking ads out in the newspapers. This is something he did much later, but The point is, right, this guy was driven, right? He went out and wanted to ensure that this was going to be a success, which it was, right? Um, and so following an 8-week trial period that proved him right, Lewis was promoted to manager of the Princess in 1938, and he took over the lease in 1939. Through these pioneering efforts, the Princess Theater, along with the Olivos family name, became known for its Mexican films. The Princess's transformation into the first place space dedicated to Spanish language film exhibition in Orange County was remarkable for several reasons. First, the enthusiastic reception provided by Orange County Mexicans was a testament to Olivos' vision as an entrepreneur, who was a lifelong member of Santa Ana's La Comunidad Mexicana, or Mexican community, had witnessed firsthand the emergence of a niche market. As noted by historians that kind of study Mexicans and the movies and the exhibition of Spanish language film in the United States, Mexicans loved going to the movies. And like all other Americans, because this is all American history, it's happening in the US, right? It's not happening in Mexico. Even in the 1930s, Mexican residents in San Diego invested more on amusement than on any other category of expenditure except food, clothing, and housing. Similarly, Mexican families in Los Angeles spent the largest proportion of their recreation expenditures at the movies. Alongside his contemporaries in Los Angeles and San Antonio, the kind of two centers of Spanish language film exhibition in the early 20th century, Olivos formed the vanguard of an aspiring class of ethnic Mexican businessmen that anticipated and responded to the demand for Spanish language cinema throughout the US-Mexico borderlands. Although Spanish language films had increased in popularity with Hispanic audiences since the 1920s, Olivos was the first to fill this void. That is to show Mexican films, right? Spanish language films in the Santa Ana Valley. The second key pioneering part of this is that the screening of Spanish language films in Orange County, Luis Olivos occupied the role of what scholars call a cultural broker that kind of, right, operated between the Anglo-white and the Mexican social worlds. Indeed, prior to Olivos' emergence as an entertainment entrepreneur, few Mexican-owned businesses existed outside the rural colonias and urban barrios that delineated Orange County's segregated landscape. And overall, there were more than 50 different segregated ethnic Mexican communities, meaning that they were, set apart from. And again, this is by practice. There is no statutes on the books that permitted this, but these towns, these little villages and cities within a city are almost 100% Mexicano, right? Mexican, ethnic Mexican. So in fact, through practice, they were indeed segregated. On top of that, there were over between 14 to 15 different segregated Mexican schools where upwards of 98% of the student body were ethnic Mexicans, right? And they were allowed, as many of us know, the story of Mendes versus Westminster, they were not permitted to attend other schools. Let me just go back a little bit towards the West Coast. I wasn't able to find a picture of the Princess Theater, but this is the West Coast Theater, a theater that was also later purchased and owned by the Olivos family. And so they are transcending social worlds is the point, and he's bringing social worlds together. He's bringing ethnic Mexicans into spaces, right? Into spaces that they had normally avoided. I've reviewed a lot of oral histories. Cal State Fullerton, by the way, has a tremendous collection of oral histories for all sorts of people. They have several Mexican-American collections, a Colonias collection. And in these, you read the firsthand accounts of people that basically said, well, I'm not going to send my kid to school if they're going to segregate them. They might as well go work, right? Or I'm not going to let my kids go to the movies or the swimming pools again if they're going to segregate them, right? But by filming Spanish language films in the center, of Santa Ana, right, in blocks and places that were, entirely, Anglo, and in many ways where Mexicans had been experiencing discrimination, right? They were bringing them into that world. He was promoting the interaction, right? In many ways, it was creating a multicultural society that didn't quite exist, even though these populations lived very close to each other. So let me move forward a little bit. I want to get to the part about the Yost. So again, I don't have a picture of the princess, but I'm going to skip forward a little bit to transitioning towards the Yost. Now, I want to make a point that Lewis himself was not alone in running this business. I gotta get, there we go. So here's a picture of Lewis Sr. and his wife, Phoebe. And you'll notice that he's got a military uniform on because he did indeed serve in World War II. And while he was away, guess who ran the family business? It was Phoebe. Let me find my place here. So as soon as he obtained control of the princess in 1939, Olivos enlisted and relied heavily on his spouse, Phoebe, as well as his brothers, and eventually his children to run the family business. After marrying in 1939, Lewis and Phoebe were partners in everything, including the family business. When Lewis enlisted in the armed forces during World War II, Phoebe managed the Princess Theater, in addition to running the household and caring for their young family, despite being unable to drive and having 3 young sons to care for. Phoebe kept things afloat at home and also aided in growing the family business while Lewis was away. Quote, I love this quote. This is from her granddaughter, Gay. Gay says, quote, she did it all with high heels on, unquote. Gay is very proud of her grandmother. And you think about what she did, carrying the family business, nurturing her children, doing all of this again in the 1940s, again, very untypical, right? And what a tremendous legacy that Phoebe provided for her family. So after returning home from the war, Lewis leased the Princess and State Theaters. So he goes from 1 theater to 2 theaters from the Walker family until 1952. And then the opportunity arose to purchase the historic Yost Theater on 3rd and Spurgeon. Now, acquiring the city's premier theater was a dream come true for Lewis, who had always wanted the Yost and could easily remember the days in the not too distant past when he and his friends had been forced to sit in segregated sections of that very theater. But for Lewis, owning the Yost was not about personal glory or vindication. It was about fostering a sense of La Comunidad Mexicana, the Mexican community, right there in downtown Santa Ana. Remembering an experience prior to their ownership of the Yost when he and his father stood on a corner gazing at the theater, Lewis's second son, Alfonso, recalled, quote, my dad looked at the Yost and said, I want that theater. That's my goal. Why that theater? Because it has everything. That's the theater that would be great for Spanish-speaking films. And let me get, here's Lewis's son, Luis Olivos Jr. with his spouse, Mickey Olivos. I think I have the date right. This is around the 1960s. Again, one of the wonderful photos provided by the Olivos family. I want to get to this one. Because as he starts showing films, with a lot of the films that he starts to to share and show and screen throughout the now 3 theaters that the family has, are really represent the kind of golden age of Mexican cinema. As Lewis Jr. proudly reminisced, the great legends that visited and performed at El Cine represented the creme de la creme of Mexico's top stage performers and movie stars. Actors like Pedro Infante, Tintan, Lola Beltran, and Maria Antonieta Pons, along with singers like Juan Gabriel, Javier Solis, Vicente Fernandez, and Consuelo Chelo Silva. These were among the dozens of these are A-list celebrities in Mexico that graced the Yost stage. Now, they didn't just do it in film. They would also, again, bring entertainers. I'll skip forward a little bit to get, I'll go back to all this, don't worry. But they would have stage performances, live performance. I mean, they did it all. They would even going back, here brought there we go. Brought one of Mexico's most famous kind of stage performers and biggest stars to Santa Ana in 1978. So we're skipping forward a little bit, this is Cantinflas or Mario Moreno, comedian and actor. Sold out Santa Ana College Stadium, I believe it was, and teamed up with a lot of other local businessmen to bring him here. So it wasn't just about filming, right, or showing Mexican films, but it was about, again, bringing these performers to Santa Ana. And notice that they're doing it at a time, right, the 50s, the 60s, when the demographics of Santa Ana are changing rapidly due to, right, suburbanization, right? And a lot of people moving to the suburbs, they're building the freeway system, etc. So Santa Ana is becoming increasingly Mexicano. But, again, the key is that he was kind of ahead of this trend, right, in building this kind of movie theater empire well before this big demographic transition happened. And indeed, as it's happening, Mexican immigrants are continuing to come, and you have Mexican Americans that have lived in Orange County for a long time. They're intermixing with Mexican immigrants, and that's not always a pleasant experience necessarily. They're competing over the same houses, the same jobs, sometimes the same women. And the Yost Theater and these Spanish, films are bringing again and forming, a community that doesn't necessarily exist, right? It's being built, and one of the ways that again it's being built is by bringing people together to view again these A-list movie stars. Let me move forward a little bit more here. I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, so let me get through this part. As a center point for Spanish language cultural production in Orange County, Cine Yost fostered the development of a shared sense of Mexicanidad, or Mexicanness. Right? This helped to bridge the divide between recent immigrants and Mexican Americans. To accomplish this, Luis Jr. recalled how his father would rent a bus and he would go to the bracero camps. Right? These are the contract workers that came from Mexico beginning during World War II, the 1940s, and that program was extended all the way until 1964. Okay. And Southern California, as we all know, was a huge center point, right, for a lot of these laborers. So he would rent this bus and he would take it out to the bracero camps. He would fill them up. They'd bring them back to the Yost, right? And bringing the Mexican community together, right, at El Cine was a family affair. I got some great pictures here from the family. Here we go. So it's like family members working and friends working concessions. On the top left, you have Gay Olivos there in the pink dress, and her father, Louis Jr. is on the couch all the way to the left, right? Louis Sr. is on the right, right? So you have three generations of the Olivos family, sitting there. Again, it's a family-run business, but it's a family-run business that is operating on behalf and for the community itself. It was this term, the other thing, that another fun recollection that the Olivos brothers have, and it's going back to these little flyers. There we go. Was that their dad would pick them up from school, right? And he'd give them all these flyers, and then they'd go out to the neighborhoods, and they called it beating the bushes. They'd go out there and hand these all out, right? Because they're getting these flyers out for premiere night, La Premiere, and that was like the big day, right? When the movie theaters would be packed in full. And I got another great picture later on that shows that. So think of these memories, right? I was reminiscing to someone the other day, like the best memories that I had with my father were not like when we went to Disneyland, not, I was going to say not when we went to Dodgers games, but they were when we went to Dodgers games. So I will say that that was a great memory. But it was just the everyday and the mundane. I was working in the garage, it was running errands, it was doing, my dad would drag me to school with him. He was a school principal, make me staple all these flyers he's going to give out to his teachers, right? And it just, hearing these recollections and from the Olivos family made me think of that. Something that you kind of hated doing as a kid, you then love doing later on. And those are just cherished memories, right? This physical and cultural gathering fostered by El Cine Yost reshaped the social and physical landscape of downtown Santa Ana, while also challenging the contours of ethno-racial and class segregation across the country. Indeed, as local activist and businessman Sam Romero summed up, it was here at El Cine Yost where you could come from Buena Park, South County, from all over the place. This was a central place. Many current and former Orange County residents share Romero's sentiment. In a 2008 interview, Jess J. Arujo commented that El Cine brought la comunidad, that is the community, closer to the big city. Similarly, Sarah Perez remembered how people would meet there, socialize, and get to know each other. Some, like local business owner Teresa Salivar, remembered waiting anxiously for premiere night. Let me get to one of those great photos. I mean, these are just some examples of the tremendous, again, people that came into those. Vicente Fernandez, I mean, he's like, I don't know which American singer I try to compare this to, but there's no better than Vicente Fernandez if you're Mexican, right? And he's actually, some of you might recognize Anthony Quinn there on the left, okay? Let me get to this other recollection here with Teresa Sandoval. See, you have to remember, she says, back then there were no soap operas like they have today, said Teresa. So the majority of the people would go to the movies on Wednesday because that was estreno, alongside the first class entertainment and sense of community. What comes across most vividly in patrons' recollections of the Yost was the sense of family they felt there. I remember, said Perez, Mr. Olivos was always with his children, attending, serving, and working the theater personally. Likewise, Saldivar felt it was the Olivos family that really reached the community. Economics had nothing to do with it. The Yost made entertainment for all families. It wasn't lower class, middle class, it was everyone. In this way, Cine Yost and the Olivos family brought ethnic Mexicans together physically and culturally, helping them to build bonds of ethnic solidarity despite differences in citizenship, class, and nationality. My keyboards. Oh, it's probably because of this. There we go. So we saw this one. I'll get to that picture in a second. Again, here's just a beautiful picture of the Yost Theater, just a packed house, full to capacity, maybe on one of those premiere nights, right? Or maybe on one of these nights like when they would get essentially a big movie star like Mario Amada, who's basically like the Clint Eastwood of Mexican cinema. Imagine, right, getting to go to the movies, to watch a movie, to see the movie star, right, to get to meet him, or at least catch a glimpse of him, get an autograph. This is the type of experience that residents, that patrons could have at the Yost. So after 33 years of owning and operating El Cine Yost, the Olivos family was forced into selling their beloved theater to the city of Santa Ana in April of 1985. This is basically, to make a long story short, the product of a redevelopment project gone wrong that ended up essentially bankrupting the Olivos family from being able to hold on to the theater. And they felt, definitely that they were forced to sell, right? They had no other option. Ending a 4-year battle with the city and its downtown redevelopment agency, the loss of El Cine was a devastating blow, both to the Olivos family and to the ethnic Mexicans across Orange County, who had come to view the theater as an extension of themselves, their homes, and their communities. As longtime resident and theater patron Margarita Gonzales so eloquently put it, going to the Yost felt like returning to my hometown in Mexico after being away for a long time. It felt like it was yours. It was very beautiful. The sentiment expressed by Margarita's comment, quote, "It felt like it was yours," unquote, has been echoed by many others over the past 30 years and is essential to understanding why El Cine Yost was so important to the Olivos family and the ethnic Mexican community it served. Although the loss of the theater ruined the Olivos family financially, the most bitter part of the ordeal was and continues to be the sense of betrayal that has lingered with them ever since. Quote, "As long as I live, I'll say that the city stole the theater from us," unquote, Lewis Sr. stated bluntly. "It was like taking an arm off. It hurt me that much." What was stolen from the family was not merely the building, nor the income associated with it, but a sense of place that manifested physically as much as symbolically the affirmative presence of Mexican people and culture in the city. Remember, this is the reason why Lewis Sr. starts showing Mexican films, right? He knew the culture. He knew the beauty of where he'd come from, thanks to his parents, right? Thanks to other community members. He wanted to provide that to others. This point was emphasized by Luis Olivos Jr. Several years later, when he fought back tears as he shared his most painful memory regarding the loss of the Yost. Quote, "The saddest thing is we forgot to take down the posters in each dressing room." Within days of the forced sell, Lewis Jr. returned to the theater early one morning. Quote, "I put my key into open the door to retrieve these historic posters of Pedro Infante, Tintan, Javier Solis, and my key didn't open. Oh man, it still hurts me," he said. "I realized then that the Yost was gone." So that loss of the ability even to preserve that aspect of the past. Yet for both the Olivos family and the ethnic Mexican community of Santa Ana, not all memories of the Yost are painful ones. For loyal former patrons like Margarita Gonzales, Sarah Perez, Teresa Saldivar, Rodolfo Cordova, the Yost conjures beautiful memories that to this day allow them to relive their youth. Indeed, I experienced this firsthand as I met with Louis Jr., his wife Mickey, and daughter Gay on the day after Thanksgiving in 2016. Sitting at the dinner table in their Santa Ana home, the family generously shared hundreds of carefully preserved photographs, newspaper clippings, handbills, and other pieces of Yost ephemera. As they examined and explained each cherished artifact, I witnessed the joy and satisfaction that came to Gay, Mickey, and Louis Jr. as they recalled experiences with family and friends and remembered the importance of the theater to the ethnic Mexican community. And it was in a moment like that that it helped provide, at least for me, some type of understanding and some type of closure that due to the memories, right, that have been built and preserved, right, that the Yost Theater isn't entirely gone. I mean, naturally, of course, we understand the Yost Theater is still there today. This is a picture I took in 2016 as I was waiting to meet with Gay Olivos and Louis Jr. For the first time. They hosted me for dinner just a little ways down from here at a little Mexican taco shop, and started sharing these stories with me. And it just always struck me, and even today, as I talked to Gay, who we just chatted, I think earlier this week or last week, every time we start talking, about this time period, I just feel like, it comes to life, right? And it's not even my history necessarily, it's not like my personal family history, right? But I feel like I've been brought into that, and my own family has shared beautiful memories. My grandmother, who immigrated from Mexico, as well as my mother, their experiences going to Mexican cinema, Spanish language film in El Centro, which is where my mother grew up, and we're just outside of El Centro. And so these spaces are so critical, and the preservation of these memories are crucial. Again, the Yost Theater today is very different. It looks very different from those earlier photos that we started with. Its purpose is very different. I think I heard that church services are held there. I know, concerts have been held there in recent years, and all sorts of stuff. I still kind of think the tragedy is that it's lost its identity in many ways of the place that it was, right? And so this is merely an attempt to try to preserve some of that. And I thank you for your time, and I'm anxious to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions.
Thank you so much for this very informative and deeply felt presentation. I thought it just really brought that sense of community and sense of belonging and a sense of place, something I've studied. So this just resonated with me, but I hope others really felt the power of this theater and what it meant to the community. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Gonzales, for providing this program for us this evening. So first, a round of applause. Zoom applause is quiet but mighty. And if anyone has questions, we have a few that have been put in the chat, so I'll be happy to read those out and get your response. The first question: didn't the city promise the Mexican community a cultural center, since it took the Yost and sold it to another party? That cultural center was part of the legal agreement. And also, didn't Fatty Arbuckle first perform at the Yost?
So yes, Fatty Arbuckle did perform at the Yost. And again, it was, earlier it was a theater used for vaudeville, right? Very popular form of stage performance, right? In the early 20th century. Again, it's hosted many other types of events, religious services, even long ago, and political meetings. Gay Olivos, I'm not sure if she's still with us, may be able to speak better to what was promised to the family as part of the bargain. There's a great book, if I can share real quickly, that, let me see here. It's written by Eduardo Gonzales. It's called Latino City. I'm not sure if everybody can see this. It's actually all about the city of Santa Ana, and particularly about redevelopment. It has a much nicer cover now. It's available in soft cover. This is a hard cover, but it's made of a soft cover. You can search it on Amazon, or if you want to support a local bookstore, definitely do that. You can go to bookstore.org, which would be a great place, great alternative to Amazon. And he covers kind of a lot of the urban development period that goes throughout Santa Ana. So there were several proposals for the space, and my understanding is that essentially they were planning to kind of redevelop this area as a type of like Olvera Street, like that's the idea, the Fiesta Marketplace, and kind of rebrand it, right? Try to do something about all the business that they had lost, right? To Irvine, to Anaheim, right? To businesses and people moving right outside of Santa Ana. I mean, that's a very common story for cities, particularly the urban centers of counties like Santa Ana was during, again, the 50s and 60s. You had, I mean, all that movement was facilitated by the federal government. And the federal government subsidized the purchase of homes throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s with the FHA, VA loan programs. People don't realize the 30-year amortized mortgage didn't exist until the federal government instituted it, right, as a way to first fight home losses during the Depression, but then to facilitate and keep the economy running after World War II, where they're paranoid, right, that the economy would crash, right? Things like the Federal Highway Construction Act, which built thousands and thousands and thousands of miles, the largest public works program and not even our nation's history, but in the Western Hemisphere's history up to that point. All of this, again, was part of that relocation of people, capital, businesses, right, to the suburbs that the city of Santa Ana was responding to, and unfortunately, they misplaced the attention. I mean, what you, frankly, in my view, what they shouldn't have done is just place a tenant that had been there for 30 years, right? I mean, that's like bad business practice, right? I would think. You know, again,
Hi, David.
the Yost Theater hasn't had a constant tenant since then. Hi, Gay, is that you?
Yeah, it's me.
Great.
I might have, thank you, everybody. I'm here, and actually I came to the Grand Canyon with my parents. My dad, Louis Olivos, is here next to me, and my mother, Mickey Olivos, right here. So you might hear my grandchildren in the other room kind of being a little bit rambunctious, but so bear with me. But to your point, whoever asked that question, yes, we were promised a cultural center in that area. As a matter of fact, it was Roger Cooey, who was the city manager at the time, who my parents went to Olvera Street with him. And that's where Roger Cooey got the idea to turn the Yost Theater and the surrounding businesses into a cultural center, which to your point never occurred. It was actually, the Yost was actually approached initially by Santa Ana City College, by SAC, because they needed a theater to support the SAC growing artistic community. But of course, that deal fell through for whatever reason. And then the Yost was sold, unfortunately, to a private buyer for $60,000.
This is just fascinating that would happen, that a business would be sold in that manner and things would be promised and then not, the promises wouldn't be recognized. Fascinating. And we do have some more questions. And the next one is talking about mentioning a Fullerton Theater that I think the Olivos family was involved in the larger picture of Spanish language theater in California. And Jane, you asked that question. Are you speaking about which Fullerton Theater, the Fox or maybe another theater? Do we know if this family owned a theater in Fullerton?
May I speak?
Yes, please.
Oh, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Very well. Thank you for taking my comment, I guess. I just wanted to mention that I've lived for the past 35 years here in Fullerton, and there was a small theater called the Cine Wilshire on our Wilshire Avenue. And I'm fairly sure that it was leased by the Olivos family. And Gay, maybe you could talk after.
Yes, that is
that
true.
Right?
Yes,
And
at one point, the Olivos family owned actually, I think, 4 theaters. We had a theater in San Bernardino called The Studio. We had the Wilshire Theater in Fullerton,
right,
where we showed Spanish films. We had the West Coast, the Yost, and we actually had a drive-in in Norco that we were co-owners of. And we also had a theater of the Anaheim Theater, which is there on Lincoln Street. I don't know if you remember that. It was on Lincoln, between Lincoln and Harbor. And again, through redevelopment with the city of Anaheim, they knocked down that theater, but we were the last owners of that theater as well. That is true.
Was that the very historic one that was in the downtown?
Yes, the historic theater in downtown Anaheim. We used to own that theater as well.
Oh my goodness.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, I just want to mention, if at some point, if it's interesting to you, I have a lot of memories, and we took a video of the theater before it was torn down in Fullerton. And the reason that since that theater was torn down, I resolved to never let another thing like that happen in Fullerton. And that's why I got so involved in saving the Fox Theater in our downtown. It was due to the devastation from seeing your theater go away. I may even have some old flyers and so forth from it if you're interested. The last thing I wanted to mention as well was, have you been at all involved with the books by Nicolás Canelos? He writes about traveling Spanish language theater that even existed before California was founded, going back and forth between Mexico and California, pre-statehood. I believe it was pre-statehood, and then even afterwards, and how it continues down to this day, and with theaters and movie theaters, and not just traveling legitimate theater. I just wanted to mention that because the Yost and the West Coast were part of it, even a larger history of traveling theater groups.
Thank you, Jane. And
Sorry for the long comment.
No, that's why we're here. And thank you, Gabe, for being here and for providing so much information on this topic. This is your life, your family's life story.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Alfonso?
Yes, it's Alfonso Olivos. Yes, a couple of comments. My aunts, Herminia Marval and also Consuelo Jaramillo, they told the story where they saw Charlie Chaplin at the Yost Theater. And that's another plus for the history of the Yost. It was quite a loving experience. Sometimes I'm still thinking about it, I tear up. And I think, like was mentioned before, I believe the Olivos family was wrong by the city of Santa Ana and its neighbors that were around the theater. They promised a lot, but they didn't come through with their promises. And that hurt my dad very much because he helped not only the Yost Theater, but he always helped the neighboring business in the area. Always pro Santa Ana, pro Latino. So many things he'd done, David, that they're not, I'd like to sit down with you again and talk to you about. And he would invite the colleges, Long Beach City College, Santa College, the different high schools in the county, to come and see a movie in Spanish, so they can help him get the right rhythm of the words and things like that. So and many other things that hopefully we can share down in the near future.
Thank you so
Alfonso,
much.
thank you for the comment. I'll be in Orange County, hopefully COVID permitting, for like a month during the summer. So as long as we get this thing under control, my university will finally let me travel again.
Okay, great. Hopefully so.
But I wanted to thank your comment because Alfonso made a comment about the. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, you made a comment about the displacement of your family, and it's such a common, again, narrative that historians have been exploring over the last several decades with these urban redevelopment programs. And as you mentioned, your father, it wasn't just about the Yost Theater. I had an earlier picture there of the Fox Theater. You notice there's a taqueria right next to it. The Yost Theater, these theaters became, a place that attracted other businesses. Note that businesses were leaving Santa Ana. And here you have ethnic Mexican, right, like the Olivos family, they're creating businesses and they're creating tax revenue that the city wants, right? But then they come up with these redevelopment plans and they're obsessed, with trying to attract the people they lost, and they ignored and didn't even pay attention to the people that they had. And there's a phenomenal recent book called Barrio America, and the subtitle is How Latino Immigrants Saved the American City. And it talks a lot about essentially exactly experiences like the Olivos family how at the time when urban cities are suffering from massive population losses, right, that it's Latinos that are coming in and filling the void. They are, increasing the population, increasing the tax base, they're creating businesses, right? They're turning these cities around at the same time that the cities, again, create these redevelopment plans to displace and remove them. But again, just to make a kind of bigger pull into, Santa Ana is kind of a microcosm in many ways of what's happening throughout the country during this time.
Yes, another thing too that I just it was mentioned before, I think by Gay, that the theater was sold to this development company for $60,000, and my dad at that same night at that same council meeting, he offered to buy it back at $360,000, and then later on he even was trying to negotiate. We offered to buy it back for $600,000, and they really they said, well, in a way they said no, but they put, excuse for the expression, they put the screws on my dad at that time. They didn't give him enough time to come up with the funds for he already had the source, but they put a time limit, and he couldn't meet that time limit. It was a few hours they gave him, and that was really a blow to my dad. I think it hurt him spiritually and mentally and physically.
I can imagine. I can just imagine how that would be very, very gut-wrenching after all of your family's contributions.
And then the day that we were, like I say, I was there at 7 o'clock in the morning to go to the Yost Theater just to check to see if anything was left inside the theater. And I called my key, I put my key in the lock, and it didn't work anymore. Didn't have access to our second home. And I called my dad, I called my brother Louis, says, you know what? They changed the locks on the theater. We can't get in. And then my dad came within about 10, 15 minutes. My dad got there, and we stood across the street in the alley. And I remember his words. Excuse me. He looked at the Yost Theater, and he said, "Goodbye, old friend. You've taken care of me and my family for so many years, and now I can't help you." And that was very sad. That was very, very sad.
Thank you for sharing your emotional connection with us. That takes a lot of courage, and we really appreciate that. And there's a question about in the chat that asked, was there any legal challenge to what Santa Ana did? Was there any way to question this sale and then the cultural center that you weren't able to have? Was there anything your family could do?
We did go to the court, but at that time, all of us, my dad, myself, my brother Louis, our funds they wouldn't have the funds to fight. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
We didn't have our source of income, and any resources we had, they raised trying to fight.
Yeah, and that's a very valid and real ramification. You weren't able to, as you said, fight because of the cost. Dr. Gonzales, can you speak to that as well? Just how that was difficult for them to do anything because of the cost.
Yeah, I mean, it's the, again, I think a lot of us can understand this, in regards to what we see covered a lot in the media today. I mean, a great way for people that have attorneys and power is to take things to the courts, right? And, you have the Olivos family who had run a very efficient and effective business. I mean, owning several theaters, and, they directed everything in trying to save the Yost. I mean, the Yost was the jewel. And they had other theaters that they remained and operated after the Yost, but again, it's not just the finances that, as we can see with Alfonso, right? Imagine the emotional exhaustion, of dealing with this, day in and day out, right, for months. I mean, fighting again, not a single person, but an entity of investors, and with the backing of and local officials. And again, I'm in no way, I'm not trying to make anyone out to be evil. I want to make that clear. I want to point back to again the imagery that I promoted earlier with the warp and the weft and the palimpsest. But from the perspective of people that live this, right, and experience the other side, right. This is what it felt like. This is what is true to their experience. This was true to the community's experience. Losing a cherished institution where some people met their spouses. I mean, think about that, right? Where again, as I emphasized in the presentation, where people that in some ways, right, again, might have had internal community like animosities and conflict, they're able to put those aside when they go to a place and they enjoy something together, right? Eat a hot dog together, right? And watch a movie. There's nothing more American than that. And I want to continue to emphasize this is American history, right? This is not ethnic history. It's not Mexican history. This is American history. This happens in America. Mexican Americans don't exist outside of America. Hispanics and Latinos don't exist outside of America, right? Outside of America, they're Cubans, they're Salvadorans, right? They're Guatemalans, right? There's no such thing as Hispanics and Latinos outside the United States. So this is all our history. It's not just local history, it's national history, right? And so these relationships, these identities, these spaces, they are American, right? As much as they are, about this ethnic community coming together, really coming together, coming to see itself as part of the larger county, the memories of the patrons. Again, you could come from anywhere from Orange County. If I should have had a better map up here to show just how broadly distributed all the barrios and colonias were. People would travel for, again, miles, right, to this center place, right?
That definitely was a community, a heart. Do you know where the name Yost is, why it was called the Yost in your research? One of the questions asked that.
I don't know if that was one of the former owners. That wasn't, as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't the
former
original
owner.
name.
David, I think it was a family, a business family
Right.
from Santa Ana. There was Yost.
Right.
No,
right.
excuse me, this is Gay. I did a lot of research on the Yost when this is how it all transpired. I went back to college to get my paralegal degree and I had to take a history class, and lo and behold, my professor Luis said, "You're going to write about your family." So I did a lot of research on this, and actually Yost was an actual man that came from Mr. Yost that came, I want to say Chicago area, and he was in love with the theater. And so he's the one that when he came to California, purchased the building and called it after him, Mr. Yost, actually. And he's the one that started bringing vaudeville. That's from my research when I was digging on the founder of the Yost.
Thank
And it
you.
was opened as the Auditorium, I think was the original name.
That's true.
Thank you so much, Gay. There was another question about if your family invited the artist Amicio Vasquez to paint a mural on the north wall of the Yost that commemorated all the Mexican performers that appeared there. Was there a mural?
This is Alfonso once again. We approached Mr. Vasquez to do some murals there at the theater. But one of our biggest projects was that we were, thinking ahead, like my dad was always thinking ahead. He wanted to put murals on the alley, on the outside of the Yost. He wanted to put murals of the history, the Hispanic history of Orange County, and also of the movie stars of the Mexican era, golden era. Not only there, but also at on the alley over there by the El Cinema West Coast, the West Coast, and the lobby of the Cinema West Coast. We had a real nice lobby. It was a good place to put photos. I mean, murals.
She does.
To answer your question, this is Gay. To answer your question, yes, there were a lot of local artists that came and painted on the walls We also used to own the Plaza Olivos, which is used to be the old bus station there on Spurgeon, and I want to say, is it Third and Spurgeon? And we hired these are old artists, Osvaldo. That's all I know him by Osvaldo, the first name. And he built beautiful murals inside the restaurant, the cafe, and downstairs. So to your point, is that my grandfather always believed in maintaining the cultural identity. And so he would hire local artists to go ahead and paint those walls. So yes, that's a true statement.
Thank you. The person who asked the question, Ms. Pena, also said the new owner has since put a dragons and robots. So Brendan mentioned that Ed Yost was from Pennsylvania and it came from the 1800s. So I'm not sure when he came to Santa Ana, but thank you for that. And also someone asked if the Yost was called the Orpheum previously. Maybe that was another name. We have a lot of good questions and comments. Somebody's recalling that their daughter worked in the office at the Yost for 10 years and she had to retrieve banker's boxes from the basement. And she swore that the place was haunted. Alfonso, what do you think? Was it haunted?
The Walkers owned what, 4 or 5 theaters in downtown Santa Ana. They go the Broadway, the State, was the West End, the Yost and the Yost and the Princess. And one time I remember I ran across some drawings in chalk, real beautiful drawings in chalk. And I think they had maybe at one time they had planned to name one of the theaters the Orpheum, because I saw that marquee painting of that. And another sad thing is we used to collect, one of my jobs was at the theater was to collect the window cards and the 4x8x10s and save them. And sadly, they were destroyed by a flood from a parking lot they built behind the Yost, the West Coast Theater. And they was invaluable. They went back into the still photos from the 1920s all the way. It had Humphrey Bogart was a young kid. All these beautiful pictures, not only of the Anglo movies, but of the Mexican. And they were quite a history. They were had them in boxes, but like I say, they got ruined by a flood that occurred when I don't know what they done with some pipe, and the water flooded the downstairs of the backstage area of the West Coast Theater.
But to answer your question regarding the ghosts, I as a little girl, I was at the Yost at any family business with all my cousins from sun up to sundown. So we would, as kids running through the bottom of the Yost and in the orchestra pit, which used to be at the Yost, I don't know if it's there now, we became very comfortable at the Yost. And my grandfather would tease us and say, "Oh, don't mind the ghost," right? So we would say, "We saw a shadow." He goes, "Oh, that's the ghost," And so as kids, we grew up thinking, "Oh, that's just the ghost. Don't worry about it. It's just the ghost." I don't know if he was teasing us or there was truth to the matter, but I'll tell you, as a child running those hallways, we would see shadows. We would see quite a few shadows. We would see somebody sitting in the front seat, and my grandfather would say, "Oh, that's just the ghost. Don't be afraid of the ghost. Just learn to live with them." And that's the way we took it. We learned to live with the ghosts at the Yost, So I'd have to say, yeah, there's probably some truth to that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gay and Alfonso. Hearing your real-time experiences, your memories, your emotions really brings this story much more to a vivid life. It really speaks to the community of this theater, especially when your family owned it. On the call today, I just wanted to point out that we have Elizabeth Romero, and she's one of the many granddaughters of Phoebe and Louie. So she's joining us today. And Stephanie, she was asking if this is recorded, if there's a chance she can actually have the recording. So I wanted to ask we can talk about it near the end, but before it went too much farther, I wanted to make sure I mentioned that she was here, and she definitely would like the recording of this. You've gotten a lot of great chat compliments for this wonderful presentation. All of you who participated, the family, Dr. Gonzales, and somebody just said that it would be a good title for a story or a chapter, The Ghost of the Yost. I think that's a good point.
Well, I just want to say, could I just say about the ghost of Yost? If there
Yes.
was a ghost at the Yost, I would have given him a broom so it can help me sweep all the time I was there, because I used to sweep the theater at all hours, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes after the theater would close and all that. But if there was a ghost, I didn't catch him.
You would have
Coulda
put him
helped
to
me out.
work.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'll just add very quickly that of our Zoom meetings that we've conducted over the past several months, that those that we've had permission to record will be going up on our YouTube channel probably in the next month or so, and then we'll link them back to our website. So those will be available for viewing.
Thank you,
Right.
Stephanie. Awesome. We have one more comment, it looks like, from Allison. According to Ghost Adventures, singer-songwriter Ernest Ball, famous for Irish music, frequently performed at the Yost, but in 1927, he died very suddenly in his dressing room. Oh boy. Oh my. That's pretty ghost-like.
So now we have a singing ghost.
You have a singing ghost.
Okay.
Yeah. Did anyone else have comments or questions for the family members who are here? Dr. Gonzales, this has been a fascinating, lively, emotional journey to understand the cultural place that's important, and it's standing the community and how important it was, and then to find out what happened, for why it changed. I didn't know about that, and still kind of pondering and absorbing that fact that it was sold in the way that it was, and that the key didn't work in a few days' time. That's harsh. That's difficult to deal with. And thank you so much again for presenting tonight, Dr. Gonzales, but also to the family members for bringing your color and your feelings and your memories about the Yost Theater to us. So it really speaks to us. And Mary is saying, Mary Garcia, she witnessed it all, the entertainment, and probably a lot more by going to those movie experiences, the community that was fostered there. I don't see any more comments or questions. Before too many people leave, I do first want to again thank you, Dr. Gonzales. Round of applause, and the Olivos family. Thank you so much. For our next session, which will be in May, our next month's speaker will be the cultural director of the Juanino Band of the Mission Indians, Miss Adelia Sandoval, and she'll be talking about their history and their presence in Orange County. I can't even tell you how excited I am. I will just leave it at that. I'm stoked. The meetings and the topics that we get to explore, because Zoom gives us this wider sort of process and wider reach, has just made these meetings so much more enriching. So I'm looking forward to May. And again, thank you so much for this presentation tonight, Dr. Gonzales. And to you, Gay and Alfonso, thank you so much for coming tonight.
You're welcome.
Everybody who participated.
You're welcome.
This has been awesome, just absolutely awesome.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good, blessed evening.